always a positive and should always be listed as a positive, is Reginald Walker. Sir, welcome.
Thank you, sir. And the other positive is going out to dinner with Steve Jones. He never gets alligator arms, always reaches for the check. So go with Steve Jones. He flashes the Max Scherzer money at dinner.
Maybe not to that extent, but yeah, I've been known to say, yeah, it's my turn. All right. All right. Nobody knew about this except maybe the highest levels at Fox and maybe the highest levels at USC, UCLA, and the Big Ten. Nobody knew about it until John Wilner broke the story last week. When you found out about it, what was your immediate reaction?
It was two things, actually three. The first thing was, well, who called each other first? UCLA called USC or USC called UCLA? That's an interesting question in and of itself. The second thing I thought of was the expanded reach, obviously, of the TV markets. And the third I thought was, I knew there was movement, or there was going to be more movement. That was not what I expected from the Big Ten. Mm-hmm. And so kudos to Kevin Warren. And then you immediately go into like research mode, like where are things going? And you think about it. Once USC and UCLA come into the Big Ten, think about this, Steve. 5 out of the top 10 media markets are immediately in the Big Ten footprint. You got New York, right? That's the Rutgers tie. That's market 1. Market 2 is LA. Right, USC, UCLA, we just talked about that. Market 3, Chicago, obvious there. Market 4 is Philadelphia, right? That's Penn State territory all day long. And then depending on which service you look at, market 10 is D.C., which is where Maryland sits. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden you see 5 of the top 10 markets because this is about media rights deals. So you see 5 of the top 10 markets. That tells you a lot of what they're trying to do. So then the next thing you look at is who's next. Well, I'm going to give everybody a little bit of an insight as to that. Market 11 is Phoenix. That's the Arizona schools. Mm-hmm. Okay, market 12 is Seattle. That's Washington. And theoretically Oregon, right? You can just sort of lump them in there. Denver is market 16. That's where Colorado sits, right? So those are 3 I think you watch to see whether they end up. And the latest rumors are they're going to end up in the Big 12. With the exception of maybe Washington and Oregon. We'll see how that plays out. But you start looking at what are the TV markets and who's going to acquire what TV markets. And for the Big 12, I'm sure they're going to be looking and going, we might as well get Utah because we already have BYU coming. Yeah. That'll keep our foothold on that market. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Watch market 16 in Denver, what happens with the Colorado Buffaloes.
Yeah, good points because to me, this is not just about markets. It's also about brands. USC and UCLA, brought heavyweight brands to a heavyweight brand conference. In other words, I'll give you an example. Stanford and Cal, yes, they're in the number, 5, 6 TV market in the country, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose. Right. BC is in Boston, another heavyweight market. But you and I both know they don't bring the brand. The brand doesn't line up with the market.
Correct. It's about brand equity and what that brand equity does for you from a TV standpoint. And I'll take it right back to TV. Just think about this. Let's look at perhaps the last week of the regular season, right? For instance, all of a sudden you look up and you've got something like you've got Michigan, Ohio State, obviously, at noon, perhaps on Fox, right? Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden your 3:30 game can feature a USC team that comes east, right? Or a UCLA team that comes east.
Right.
And then that late game at 7:30 or 8 o'clock can feature, I'm going to make this up, what if it's Penn State at UCLA?
Right.
That's going to get eyeballs at 7:30 on Saturday night, the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. That is what the game is about right now. Yep. And so now you look at this conference and they can touch the Eastern time zone, the Central time zone, and the Pacific time zone, which that'll sweep in some of the Mountain time zone as well. All of a sudden, you've got the entire country covered, and you can do 3 games in those windows on one network with a conference.
All right, so let's go down to your neighborhood now. Obviously, the ACC grant of rights runs through 2036, and it's a hefty number. But what have you heard, if anything, about Clemson, North Carolina, maybe even Georgia Tech, Florida State? What have you heard anything down there about that? And I don't mean to the Big Ten, maybe the SEC.
Yeah, nothing overly definitive. Everybody's nervous. Everybody's looking around. I think one of the things we're going to see is some added pressure on Notre Dame. I don't think they're going to crack necessarily right now. I believe their NBC deal runs until 2025 or through 2025. So they don't have to move yet, right? That allows them to sort of stay where they are. But I think Clemson's looking around. I think North Carolina's, they're all trying to figure out how do they stabilize. Now, here's the issue. When you talk about the situation that everyone is in, right? It's markets and what they bring. And if you really, really think about it, none of the big four in North Carolina sit in Charlotte, right? So the biggest market is Raleigh.
Right.
And then you go down to some of the other ACC programs down in Florida, Coral Gables, Miami, okay, I'll give you that one. But Florida State is not Tallahassee is not like it's a top 50 media market. Pitt is in the top 50, but again, that's not the stranglehold of the entire league. It's not concentrated mostly in that area. You mentioned Boston College earlier and Syracuse as well. They get eyeballs in their cities, particularly Syracuse, but in Boston College, with all due respect to that fan base, they're the third or fourth or fifth thing that people are paying attention to in Boston. So you look at those types of things. Everybody in the ACC, from what I understand, is sort of looking around trying to figure out what's next. They do realize they have that grant of that media rights, the grant of rights, I should say, through 2036, as you mentioned. But the question there is, if a bunch of schools plan to leave, who are you going to make pay it?
Exactly, and that look. It was looked at that right now the Pac-12's value has gone from $42 million a school down to $30 million a school just in one move, and the Big Ten is about to get a big kick up. So Tara Vanderveer, we all have great respect for her as a coach, but she's saying I don't see how the travel and the money for that. Tara, you're going into the assumption you got $42 million. They're going to have $100. Okay, there's enough money in the budget to travel. Okay. Michael Martin is the president of Florida Gulf Coast University, who, by the way, just hired Pat Chambers as their basketball coach a couple of months ago. When he was the president, the chancellor at LSU, he spoke to the Knight Commission for 3 hours in October 2011. And he said, I think ultimately what will end up will be two enormous conferences. This is 2011, he said this. Two enormous conferences, one called ESPN and one called Fox. How prophetic was Michael Martin in 2011?
Spot on. And it becomes that. And you sort of look at it and you think back and you go, a lot of people may have kind of half-heartedly dismissed him, half-heartedly understood where he was coming from. But now you look at the landscape. Remember, CBS is essentially walking away from the SEC, right? NBC has Notre Dame. Who knows what that looks like 3 years from now? So all of a sudden you look at the networks, you look at where the money is coming from. There's only two that are writing really, really big checks. There are only two that need that sort of, where can we find that content, right? Where do we find a way to fill all these hours of television we have? And so what happens on the back end of that is you get a bunch of people that are going to get some cheaper real estate. So I would be curious to watch, to that point, watch CBS and watch NBC if they walk away from the Notre Dame deal, and how they can perhaps take some of these smaller conferences and build them up without costing a lot of money.
Reginald, I think what's going to happen is that NBC is going to do what they can to keep Notre Dame, right? Yep. But I think what you're going to see is CBS is going to fill the void at 3:30 with the Big Ten, and NBC is going to do a primetime Big Ten game. I think that's where they're going to shift. And Fox is not going to go after the Pac-12. They're not going to go after the Big 12. They're going to save their money, and they're going to go after a chunk of the college football playoff. That's my guess. How about that for let's throw darts against the wall and see which one sticks?
Well, I think that completely lies in the hands of whether or not the college football playoff expands. I think basically what we're seeing is that they're going to have to expand. If these conferences are going to be this big, that playoff is going to have to expand. Now, the other thing that I think is interesting, Stephen, and I think this is something I'm sure you're keeping an eye on as well, is how these conferences are trying to get away from divisional play.
Yes.
And I keep telling everybody, I understand what they're trying to do, and making sure they get, quote, the best two teams, there's still a chance you're not going to get that, because what if they don't play each other? And all of a sudden you look up, because remember, these conferences they're bordering on 18, 20, 22 deep.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a chance that three teams that don't play each other all go undefeated. And then what's the solution? And that's where I think this game gets a little murky as it relates to the playoff and how you get those teams in. As you know, I've said this to you a million times. As a player, all I want to know is, what do I have to do to get to where I want to go? And at least in the way it's set up, at least over the past few years with divisions in each conference, I know win my division, win my conference championship game, and I've got a chance to play for a national championship. The way these changes are going, that may not necessarily be the case.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for your perspective. Really appreciate it. Talk soon.
Absolutely, and I guess next time it'll be my turn to pick up the check.
Nah, I'll still pick up the check for you. You're worth it. You're worth it. Thanks, Reginald.
Anytime.